what we saw were endless flat prairies with no trees and no creeks. This is Canada? Out here we shall live for the rest of our lives? Did we do the right thing? Such thoughts came to all of us as the train took us deeper and deeper. Peter Svarich, 1898.
By the late 19th century, the Canadian government had effectively cleared the prairies of the indigenous populations. To ready the land for European settlement, the Dominion Land Survey subdivided 178 million acres into 27 million quarter sections. To populate the newly surveyed land, Clifford Sifton, the federal minister of the Interior, sought out tenant farmers from the Austro-Hungarian provinces of Galicia and Bukovina in what is now present-day Ukraine. For a $10 fee, a homesteader got a quarter section of his choice. If, after 3 years, he had cultivated 30 acres and had built a house, he gained title to the quarter section, 160 acres. Many did not agree with Sifton's choice of immigrants. Former Prime Minister of Canada, Mackenzie Bowell, wrote,
"Looking at the disgusting creatures after they pass through on the CPR on their way west has caused many to marvel that beings bearing human form could have sunk to such a bestial level."
Approximately 170,000 Ukrainians arrived in Canada from 1891 to 1914. Michael Gauda was an atypical Ukrainian immigrant. Well-educated and a poet, he became a leader of his fellow countrymen. In 1907, he enlisted in the Canadian Home Guard and sought to organize a Ukrainian regiment in the Canadian Army. An admirer of British values and democracy, Gauda, in his poem To Canada, wrote that Ukrainians would become recognized as fully Canadian only when they had fought and shown readiness to die for their adopted country.
And are you now not, O Canada, our own? No, we're still only holders of thy soil. We have not yet bought by sacrifice, and grown the right to boast a country where we toil. Our children shall be free to call thee theirs, to live and strive, and die if need be, to save the country that had made us free.
In 1914, Britain and its allies, France and Russia, went to war against Germany, Austria, and Turkey. Canada, as a member of the British Empire, automatically joined in the fight. Amongst the appeals for volunteers to fight for king and country, Michael Gauda's call for a blood sacrifice by Ukrainians was dismissed outright by the government. Because they were wrongly suspected of having sympathy for the Austrian enemy, some 80,000 immigrants, mostly Ukrainians, who were not naturalized, were forced to register as enemy aliens. Those that were naturalized for less than 15 years were disenfranchised. Those who disobeyed the War Measures Act, or were unemployed or simply indigent, were rounded up by the police and interned in camps where they did forced labor. It is a truism that borders both unify and divide people. While Austrian Ukrainians were prevented from enlisting in the Canadian Army, Ukrainians from the Russian Empire, a British ally, were welcomed. Philip Conowell, a Ukrainian born in the Russian Empire, fought for Canada and won the Victoria Cross, the British Empire's highest award for valor. For 2 days in August of 1917, Cornwall killed single-handedly 16 enemy soldiers during the battle for a strategic high ground dubbed Hill No. 70. During the 10-day battle for the hill, over 8,000 Canadians were killed or wounded. Enemy losses were estimated at over 25,000. The 1920s were boom times on the Canadian prairie. Wheat prices reached record highs. Peter Swarich, who wondered if he did the right thing immigrating to Canada, was by the mid-20s a successful homesteader as well as businessman. His business ventures included a series of rural co-op stores, a real estate office, a lumber yard, and a funeral home. The rising demand for farm and industrial workers during the 1920s persuaded the federal government to bring in some 200,000 immigrants, of whom 65,000 were Ukrainian. The response to this second wave of so-called non-preferred immigration was loud and shrill. No less a personage than the Anglican Archbishop of Saskatchewan, George Exton Lloyd, referred to Ukrainian immigrants as
dirty, ignorant, garlic-smelling, non-preferred continentals.
Professor Watson Kirkconnell of Wesley College in Winnipeg challenged Archbishop Lloyd.
The immigrants bring to us the undeveloped potentialities of virgin stock. That their true quality is not evident until the second generation is shown by the fact that out of 12 scholarships in the first year of the University of Manitoba, 10 were captured by New Canadians and 2 by our vaunted Anglo-Saxons.
In 1929, the North American stock market crashed and ushered in a decade of the Great Depression. Farm income dropped by over 50%. Many abandoned their farms and sought relief in the cities. In the urban centers, 30% of the workforce was unemployed. The Canadian journalist James Gray wrote,
I came to appreciate for the first time the tremendous advantage it was to be a Canadian Anglo-Saxon. Anyone with a Ukrainian name had almost no chance of employment except through manual labor. For the young, there was a possible solution. They could change their names. Chernicki became Kingston, Dazakowicz became Dawson.
By 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had gained control of the German nation. In 1938, the Nazis annexed Austria and the German-speaking Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia. The following year, Hitler signed a mutual non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin, the communist dictator of the Soviet Union. If one went to war, the other wouldn't interfere. With this devil's bargain, the stage was set for war. On September 1st, 1939, only a few days after signing the pact with Stalin, Hitler invaded Western Poland.
All Poles will be exploited and will disappear from this world. It is imperative that the great German nation consider the elimination of all Polish people as its chief task. Heinrich Himmler, head of the Nazi SS.
With the Polish invasion, Hitler set in motion what would become his so-called final solution, the genocidal murder of the Jewish people.
We must annihilate the Jews wherever we encounter them, and whenever possible. In one way or another, we will have to finish off the Jews. Nazi Governor of Poland, Hans Frank.
Britain and France, allied with Poland, declared war on Germany on September the 3rd, 1939. On September 10th, Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King followed Britain in declaring war on Germany. On September 17th, in accordance with the Hitler-Stalin Non-Aggression Pact and under the pretext of liberating the ethnic Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, Soviet armies invaded eastern Poland, where they were congratulated by their German colleagues. The communist secret police then began a campaign of mass execution and deportation to Siberia of Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jews deemed enemies of the state. A few months after its invasion of eastern Poland, Soviet forces occupied Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well as parts of Finland and Romania. The Allied reaction to these Soviet land grabs was mute. In Canada, Ukrainian Canadian organizations rallied their communities in support of Canada's entry into the war. Music concerts and dance performances were organized to provide funds for the purchase of war bonds, while newspaper ads and articles encouraged young Ukrainians to join the armed forces.
It was evident to everyone in Canada that Nazism was a strong and threatening dictatorship. It had to be fought. There was an awareness that Ukrainians mustn't be seen as second-rate citizens. And one way to do that was to fight for their country.
For people on the farm, it was rough. There was economic depression and psychological depression too. Guys joined up because it paid, and you could get 3 square meals a day.
There was a number of reasons for enlisting. One of them was the desire to get out and see what the rest of the world was all about. Also, there was an element of discrimination growing up in Saskatchewan. I wanted to show I was as good a Canadian as anyone else could be.
In 1942, I joined the Canadian Women's Army Corps. I was a Canadian and wanted to do my bit for the country.
We felt that these were crucial moments. Europe would be rearranged, and hopefully, Ukraine would win its independence. And we wanted to be part of that.
I was a graduate of the Royal Conservatory. I sang in the United Church and also conducted the choir in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Vegreville. That gave me training in conducting. Our band started with 26 girls. After the 3rd year together, we had 40. We were used for parades, for recruiting, for encouraging people to buy war bonds. We traveled across Canada, from Cape Breton to Victoria. In those days, you didn't associate band instruments with girls, so it was kind of a curiosity.
The Battle of the Atlantic from 1939 to 1945 was the largest continuous battle of the Second World War. Escorted by Royal Canadian Navy ships and sometimes aircrew, the Canadian Merchant Navy delivered troops, equipment, and food from North America to Britain.
I went over from Halifax to Greenock, Scotland, on the Ile-de-France, which served as a troop ship. I'll never forget that ride. The storm was so bad, the captain ordered everyone to go below deck. 2 destroyers escorted us. You could hear them dropping depth charges day and night. The Germans really wanted to bring us down. There were 17,000 troops on our ship. We were lucky and made it to Scotland all right.
We had boys from every province in Canada. There were all kinds of nationalities: Ukrainian, Polish, Italian, Jewish. We escorted the convoys like a mother hen keeps her chicks under her wing. We were on the lookout for German submarines. When the alarm rang, we would rush to our positions and drop depth charges. It took us 10 to 12 days, sometimes 19 days, to cross the ocean. We would often do what's called evasive action. We would go north to Iceland, where it would be very, very cold. Ice would form on the railings. Then we would change course and go southeast into the warm Gulf Stream. Sometimes the storms could be bad. You get into a trough and you see a 40 to 60 foot wave coming at you. It can be quite hairy, let me tell you. It feels like being in a tomato soup can, not in a ship.
The German submarines, hunting in wolf packs, took a devastating toll on the ships making the Atlantic crossing.
My first operation was flying Hudsons, protecting the convoys crossing the Atlantic from North America to Britain. We only had a 7-hour endurance time, and the same thing on the British side. It was in the middle of the Atlantic that the U-boats caused the most damage because there was no cover. A submarine had to see the ship that it was going to torpedo, so they had to raise their periscope. Waves would form whitecaps, which would immediately disappear. A whitecap that didn't disappear was a periscope wake.
I was a coder, coding and decoding messages. I was also on depth charges with the boys on the starboard side. On August 21st, 1944, our ship, the HMCS Alberni, was torpedoed. She sank in less than a minute. 59 of my 90 crewmates died.
Over the course of the war, more than 1,600 Merchant Navy sailors were killed, while about 2,000 Royal Canadian Navy personnel lost their lives. On the 10th of July 1940, in advance of a planned invasion of Britain, Hitler launched the Luftwaffe to destroy the Royal Air Force and bomb the British population into submission. Despite the destruction, the British took the bombing in stride and overcame the threat. The German aerial attack was ultimately beaten back by the RAF in what was the first all-air battle in history. Hitler was forced to postpone his invasion of Britain and turned his attention once again to Eastern Europe. On June 22, 1941, less than 2 years after the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, the Nazis launched a massive surprise attack on the Soviet Union. Many of the diverse nations that were under Soviet rule welcomed the Germans as liberators from communist tyranny. After World War I, Ukrainians were left stateless, their territories having been divided by neighboring powers. The hope of some Ukrainians that the Nazis would somehow help them re-establish an independent Ukrainian state was both misplaced and short-lived. The Germans dismissed outright any notion of Ukrainian autonomy. Ukrainians and all other Slavs were treated as Untermensch, subhumans who were to do the bidding of the German master race. Those who resisted the Germans were executed or sent to concentration camps.
We must remember that the lowest German worker is racially and biologically 1,000 times more valuable than the population here. If I meet a Ukrainian worthy of being seated at my table, I must have him shot. Erich Koch, Nazi Reichskommissar of Ukraine.
Under Koch's orders, over 2 million young Ukrainian men and women were shipped to do slave labor in Germany and the occupied countries. As Hitler's armies marched across Ukraine to Moscow, the Communist Soviet Union became allied with the capitalist democracies, proving the adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
I was born in Western Ukraine. When I got my naturalization papers, I was so happy to be Canadian. My neighbors said I should join the Winnipeg Grenadiers. There is quite a few Ukrainian boys there, and that's how I joined up.
In 1941, at the request of Great Britain, almost 2,000 troops, made up of the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles from Quebec City, were sent to the British colony of Hong Kong to reinforce the garrison there. Neither of the two battalions had undergone any battlefield training. Although Japan had been at war with China since 1937, it was not at war with Britain. A Japanese attack on British possessions was deemed unlikely, and besides, British intelligence told the Canadians if the Japanese did attack, they would be easily defeated because the Japanese were small, nearsighted, and couldn't fight at night. Under cover of darkness, on December 7th, 50,000 well-trained, battle-hardened Japanese troops attacked Hong Kong. For 18 days, despite their lack of battlefield training and being outnumbered 10-1, the Canadians and their allied comrades fought back with extraordinary courage. On Christmas Day, 1941, the British governor of Hong Kong deemed the situation hopeless and surrendered. 250 Canadians died in battle and 493 were wounded. In the almost 4 years that they were prisoners of the Japanese in Hong Kong and later in Japan, the Canadians were forced to do slave labor.
In Hong Kong, we expanded the airport. We had to move a hill and cement the runway. In Japan, we were made to work in the coal mines. There were cave-ins, and a few of the boys were killed there. The rations were small: a handful of rice, a pickled radish, a piece of pickled fish. I and a lot of the guys got berry.
We started getting diarrhea, skin diseases. We got hot feet, so hot that it would drive you crazy. Diphtheria broke out, and we lost quite a few men from that.
The work and living conditions and the brutality of the Japanese camp guards resulted in the death of 246 Canadians. Bomber Command, composed of both the Royal Canadian Air Force and the RAF, as well as pilots from other Commonwealth countries, was organized to carry out prolonged night raids to destroy German military and industrial targets and to break German morale.
I was a navigator and flew from 1943 to 1945.
would fly at 20,000 feet. The German shells had a 20-second fuse from the time that they were launched. They didn't have to have a direct hit. They would have a killing range of 100 yards. The German artillery would try to find us with searchlights. They would cone us with the lights and shoot their cannons into the cone. A few times we were badly shot up. Sometimes one engine was shot away, sometimes two engines. Fortunately, none of our boys got injured. Many of the boys in Bomber Command weren't so lucky. I know of one squadron where not a single guy finished his tour of operations. They'd all been shot down and killed.
These bombing raids took a terrible toll on the crews.
I worked as a gun armorer in various Bomber Command air bases in England. The Lancasters had blockbuster bombs. 4,000-pound bombs. When the plane took off, the pilot had to make sure he didn't bounce. If they bounced, he's dead. One time, on our runway, a plane blew up. Everybody was killed, except the tail gunner. There was a lot of these accidents that killed a lot of crew, both taking off and landing.
I served on a Lancaster as a bomb aimer and gunner. I completed a tour of 10 bombing missions over Germany. We were told in our briefing that there'd be some bad weather. When we got back, our landing areas were under thick fog and drizzle. We couldn't even identify our landing base, but our fuel was rapidly decreasing. The control tower stacked us up at 500 feet, and we kept circling and circling, and our pilot decided it was time to land. We landed safely. After us, 2 Lancasters trying to land collided. 2 more came in too low and hit some high ground and crashed. That morning, we lost 26 airmen. Only 2 survived.
I was a medical assistant in the RCAF. I assisted the doctors with the wounded, changed bandages, took blood, gave injections. I would play sports with the airmen during the day, and then I'd pick up some of their bodies after they came back from their bombing runs, or when they crash-landed. At the beginning, I used to have nightmares that a dead body was under my bed. After a while, these dreams of dead bodies stopped, and I got used to it all.
For every 100 men who flew with Bomber Command, 56 were killed in the air or died of their wounds. Their average age was 22.
On May 21, 1944, we were returning from a bombing raid over the German Ruhr Valley. The navigator informed the crew that we were 2 minutes away from the Dutch coast. A moment later, we were hit by 2 shots from a night fighter. He came under us, fired his vertical cannons, and then peeled off to the right. The navigator, wireless operator, and the mid-upper gunner were all killed. Our plane was on fire. The pilot was yelling, "Abandon aircraft now." Our pilot landed on the Dutch mainland, where he was captured by the Germans right away. I made my way to a farm where, lucky for me, the family had contacts with the Dutch underground. Mias and Franz Brawl spent the war hiding those who were in danger of being arrested by the Nazis. I lived in the Brawl house for a year and 7 months. On the day I was taken in by the Dutch underground, my parents received a telegram stating I was missing over Germany. The news devastated them. To protect the identity of those who were helping me in Holland, they were only informed that I was alive and well when the war was over.
In the north of France, in the town of Les Martres de Verre, there is a monument, a square, and a street sign that honors Pierre le Canadien. Pierre is Sergeant Peter Dmitrik from Wynyard, Saskatchewan, who in 1943, returning from a bombing run in a severely damaged plane, parachuted to safety with his crew over France. The crew dispersed and Pierre was taken in by the local Maquis, the French underground resistance. The Maquis unit commander, Antoine Lorcal, recalled Peter Dimitric with affection.
He was very popular with everyone. More French than the French, as they say. He was part of the team, as much as anyone.
Dimitric joined the Maquis in sabotaging German supply depots, bridges, and railway lines. Returning to Les Martres de Verre after a sabotage mission, Dimitric and another Maquis encountered a German roadblock, where he met his end in a hail of machine gun fire. The French government awarded Dimitric a posthumous Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. In 1943, Ukrainian Canadian service personnel set up in a rented 5-story building in London the Ukrainian Canadian Servicemen's Association, or UCSA as it was called. Serving as a hotel, canteen, and meeting place, the club was a home away from home. It organized social gatherings and celebrated religious holidays.
On a Friday, we would have as many as 40 people there, staying all at one time. The boys who were army cooks were happy to make pierogies and borscht for the boys.
My parents back in Canada told me about the UCSA Club. They would send me parcels to the UCSA address. It was nice to meet the boys from all across Canada.
When war broke out, there were only 2 recognized Christian religions, Roman Catholic and Protestant. We Ukrainians were neither. One of the first things we did was to successfully petition the military authorities for our own chaplains for the Ukrainian Catholic and Ukrainian Orthodox faiths. About 75% of our club members were between 18 and 25 years of age. They were all young, practically all single. We had a number of weddings that took place at the London Club, people meeting there for the first time. I met my own wife, Anne, there.
For the year I spent in England, the UCSA Club was my regular haunt. I met nursing sister, Lieutenant Josephine Sawchuk, at the club, and she was a regular attendee, and became my wife.
By 1942, 3 years into the war, Germany occupied most of Europe and had advanced deep into the Soviet Union. The Allies believed that a raid on the French port town of Dieppe would damage German shipping and port facilities and test the Allies' abilities to launch amphibious assaults for the future invasion of Europe. Launched from southern England on August 19, 1942, the Dieppe operation involved some 6,000 soldiers, of whom approximately 5,000 were Canadian. Major General J.H. Roberts, who commanded the Canadian infantry, said, "Don't worry, men, it'll be a piece of cake." During the course of 9 hours of battle, the Allied landing force was pounded mercilessly by the German guns inside the bunkers that overlooked the port and beaches. The raid turned into a bloody debacle.
The Germans started dropping mortar shells on us. So our officer said, "Okay, boys, let's get going." All at once, I get bullets hitting all around me. A bullet went right through my wrist. I got up again, but before I could get much further, a mortar bomb went off and I got shrapnel in my shoulder. There were corpses lying all over the beach. I pushed one on top of the other for cover.
Of my detachment, only 4 returned. The landing barges were bombarded, and the fighting was terrible. I lost all my closest friends. When I saw them being killed, I wanted to get killed with them too. Such sorrow gripped me. Our troops fought like lions, though. Our losses were 1 in every 3. The beaches were covered with dead men. Some of the boys drowned. Others got burned in their tanks. During our withdrawal to the ships, we were shot up from all sides. It was terrible.
"907 Canadians were killed. 2,460 were wounded, and 1,946 were taken prisoner. Almost 2 years after the ill-fated raid on Dieppe, the Allies invaded the Normandy coast of France. D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, was the greatest seaborne invasion in the history of war. The Allies deployed 150,000 troops, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 planes. Canada supplied 14,000 soldiers and 450 paratroopers who were dropped behind enemy lines.
I was a member of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. Our order was to design a defensive perimeter so that all the beach landings could be successful. We were to do whatever we had to do to prevent the enemy from breaking through to the beaches. The Germans had diverted a river and flooded part of the drop zone. 20 to 30 of our troops landed in the flooded area and drowned as a result of the heavy packs they were carrying. Also, the flak from the German guns didn't allow our planes to slow down, so many paratroopers landed as far away as 30 or 40 miles from the drop zone. After landing, we set out on patrols to either engage the enemy or to report to headquarters where the enemy was located.
The seaman opens the door of the landing craft and out you go. One guy next to me got it in the stomach, but we couldn't stop. We just kept going. We had rolling waves, so that helped us hide from the German guns. Those .88 caliber German guns were very accurate. Major Hodgson had his whole head blown off. Your order is to get to a particular location, and you just do it. I never said so many prayers in my life. I lay face down, hugging the ground.
Having secured the beaches, the British and Canadians were tasked with seizing the medieval city of Caen, some 12 miles inland. Caen was a major road hub and crucial to success in Normandy. As they moved inland, they met fierce resistance from panzer tank divisions and brigades of fanatical SS Hitler Youth. It took several weeks and numerous operations to capture Caen.
When we headed towards the city of Caen, we got a real beating that day. It wasn't a bloody nose. It was hemorrhaging. We lost 191 men and 21 officers.
One of our men was killed at 1900 hours by a mortar bomb as he sought shelter next to a low brick wall. The next morning, I helped the Padre wrap our comrade's body in a blanket for burial. Padre asked me to assist him in holding the limbs together while he tied them with wire, as the body was contorted with rigor mortis. Padre had the toughest job in the regiment, burying the men he had known for years, boys like me, whom he had helped turn into men.
Most of the Germans were able to escape by the time the Allies made their way through the ruins into what was the center of the city. Caen was almost completely destroyed. 2,000 French civilians lost their lives. 334 Canadians were killed, and 864 were wounded in the Battle of Caen. On June 13, 1944, a few days after the Normandy landing, the Nazis launched from sites in northern France the world's first cruise missile, the Vengeance Weapon No. 1, commonly known as the V-1. The main targets of these rockets were the City of London and southern England. Despite their often erratic trajectories, these buzz bombs, or doodle bugs, as the British called them, were deadly. The flying bomb attacks resulted in 22,000 casualties and 6,000 fatalities.
The doodlebugs were very frightening. You'd see it flying, and when its red light went off, it went straight down. You had no time to get away. They came over when people concentrated most, at morning, lunch, and at supper time.
Over time, the British were able to develop methods by which artillery and airplanes were able to shoot down the fast-moving V-1s. RCAF flying ace Russell Bonnet won the Distinguished Flying Cross for his prowess at shooting down Hitler's flying bombs.
We'd patrol along the channel at 10,000 feet. As soon as we saw them launched, we would dive down on them. It gave us about 30 seconds to shoot them down. Our squadron shot down 80 or so. I shot down 19 of them myself.
As the Germans fell back in Normandy, they became encircled by Americans, British, and Canadians in the area around Falaise, a town 30 miles to the south of Caen. The Allies surrounded 100,000 German soldiers, of whom 10,000 were killed, and 40,000 were taken prisoner. 50,000 escaped, but did so without their heavy armaments. The Allies lost more than 10,000 men, of whom about 1,500 were Canadian.
We got into the Battle of Falaise. The Brits, Poles, and Canadians surrounded the Germans and slaughtered thousands of them. We used bulldozers to move all the dead Germans and dead animals off the roads and into the ditches.
I was a sapper with the engineers. We lifted mines, kept the roads open, built bridges, and cleared away dead bodies. In the Falaise Gap, there were so many German dead soldiers that we couldn't bury them all. We were ordered to burn some. That wasn't a nice thing to do, so we found a mine shaft and we buried them there en masse.
After the Battle of the Falaise Gap, the German army in France went into full retreat. Upon reaching the Netherlands, British, Canadian, and Polish troops fought the German forces on the Scheldt River estuary.
I used to think that being in the tank corps was the safest place. Are you kidding? One shell can go through that tank and kill everyone, or set the ammunition on fire. You'd be on the road and there were burnt bodies of the tank crew. It was very hard for me to come to terms with all that.
The Dutch told us the Germans took everything from their gardens, all their livestock. The people were starving. One really sad thing to see was the effect the German occupation had on the children. They were all so skinny. It was pretty tough for us to stand outside and eat in a yard or field while hungry little ones hovered around, hoping for a handout. Most of us were quite generous to share, even though we needed all the food we were getting for ourselves. It's impossible to resist the pleading eyes of a hungry child.
In February of 1945, the Allies launched a great offensive to clear western and northern Holland of Germans. One town after another was liberated, allowing food and other relief to reach the desperate inhabitants. On May 5, 1945, the German forces in Holland surrendered.
The streets of Rotterdam were jammed with people celebrating their newfound freedom. Some were laughing, some were crying. Some were seeking revenge against those who had collaborated with the Nazis.
While the Canadian Army was liberating Holland, several Canadian divisions also participated in the American-led invasion of Germany.
We still encountered heavy German assault troops engaged in battle, while many others began surrendering. No German wanted to surrender to the Russians, who played by their own rules of war. A dozen of us took Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp holding Jews and Soviet POWs. We expected resistance, but there was none. We walked through the doors, and on the grounds were piles and piles of corpses. The British were behind us, and they dealt with what happened there. We moved on to the north.
Near Meppen, Germany, we came across a horrible German prisoner of war camp. Most of the men were captured on the Russian front. They were all ill, suffering from tuberculosis or other diseases. It was a sad collection of humanity, reduced to the point that they showed little emotion to our presence.
When the Soviet army entered the German capital of Berlin, Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker. On May 7, 1945, Germany formally surrendered, and May 8th was declared VE Day, Victory in Europe Day.
At this moment, how wonderful Mr. Churchill has come out onto the Ministry of Health balcony.
In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. God bless you all.
We were in Germany when we listened to Winston Churchill declaring victory and an end to all the hostilities. We helped ourselves to some of the cache of liquor at the City Hall. There was a stunned silence when we finally realized the fighting was over. Our relief was unbelievable as we acknowledged for the first time that we actually survived the war.
We were in a field in Holland when we heard the war was over. We cracked open a barrel of wine. I didn't drink, and I drove the boys into town, and we went dancing. The Dutch were so happy that they were finally liberated.
I was in London. We all ran down to Trafalgar Square. London just went crazy. Everyone was celebrating. All the girls were hugging us and kissing us. It was just unreal. I'll never forget that ever.
In August of 1945, almost 4 years after the fall of Hong Kong, the Americans dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
We heard a noise like thunder, and we saw the light behind the mountains, like a bright sunrise. The atomic bomb was dropped about 70 miles from our camp. This happened in the afternoon. I was working in the mines. The Japanese just took off, not a soul around. 3 days later, American planes started dropping food. Those were happy days, let me tell you.
On August the 15th, 1945, the Japanese unconditionally surrendered. World War II was over. More than 45,000 Canadians died and over 55,000 were wounded in the struggle against the Nazi and Japanese tyranny. Of the over 1 million Canadians that served in the armed forces, approximately 35 to 40,000 were of Ukrainian origin. The Ukrainian enlistment percentage was the largest of any ethnic group outside of the British. Michael sentiment that Ukrainians would ultimately need to gain full acceptance as Canadians through sacrifice on a battlefield proved prophetic.
I'm proud to have served in the Canadian Army. When we Ukrainians first arrived in Canada, we were looked upon as second class by the English and Scottish. But we proved ourselves in the war. It brought us respect.
We Ukrainian Canadians volunteered in great numbers for Canada. We fought for Canada. We performed in a fashion that was unquestionable, without any doubt. This finally gave Ukrainian Canadians the prerogative of being recognized as real Canadians.
It's estimated that by the end of World War II, there were some 20 million people across Europe who were uprooted from their homes. They included Holocaust and other concentration camp survivors, slave laborers, those who fought alongside the German armies, freed Soviet Army POWs, and refugees fleeing the advance of the Red Army. As the war was coming to a close, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Franklin Roosevelt met in the Crimean city of Yalta and signed an agreement that called for the creation of Allied zones of occupation in Germany and in Austria, as well as the creation of the United Nations. It was also agreed that, quote, individuals identified by the Soviet representatives as being Soviet citizens were subject to repatriation without regard to their personal wishes. With the assistance of the American and the British, the Soviets voluntarily and forcibly repatriated 2.5 million people back to the Soviet Union, where hundreds of thousands of them were executed or sent to labor camps in Siberia. Stalin considered the POWs who surrendered to the German army to be traitors to the motherland, and the slave laborers were labeled Nazi collaborators.
We lobbied the British and American forces about the brutality of the Soviet forced repatriation. This was something that should not be allowed. Repatriating these people against their will was sending them to a certain death. I was told of one story of men in a barracks that were surrounded by Soviet soldiers. The men set themselves in the building on fire rather than being repatriated back to the Soviet Union.
We tried to explain to the American and French authorities that the Russian motivation was a lot more sinister than appeared. We wrote numerous letters and petitions with official-looking letterhead from the Ukrainian Canadian Servicemen's Club. We had an authority which was never really granted to us.
The question of Ukrainian identity was one of the constant problems. Who, the authorities wondered, were these Ukrainians? Were they Soviet citizens who should be repatriated, or Poles who should be put in Polish DP camps? Or were they a separate people?
In 1946, I returned to Europe with the Ukrainian Canadian Relief Fund to assist the Ukrainian DPs. The early years were very hard for the DPs, very uncertain. Families would live in 8x8 rooms with blankets for walls.
Despite the enduring trauma of war and anxiety about their futures, the camp members developed a structured society.
I was inspired how the Ukrainians organized the camp. I remember visiting a high school class that was doing algebra and trigonometry. They were so far from home, in dire straits, making sure that the children received an education. The discipline, the sanitary conditions in the Ukrainian camps I visited were inspiring.
In London, in February of 1946, the United Nations organized a meeting on displaced persons. 5 of us officers, Stephen Davidovich, BOHDAN PANCHUK, myself, Joseph Romanow, and Stanley Frolick, wrote and signed a general memorandum on the plight of the refugees that were being forcibly repatriated to the Soviet Union. We made several copies and sent them to the American UN delegate, Eleanor Roosevelt, as well as many others. Later that week, Eleanor Roosevelt made a speech to the UN delegates that the repatriation agreement should be reconsidered. Much of the wording in her speech matched the wording in our memorandum. We couldn't be sure if she read our memorandum, or was it just a coincidence?
Some months later, in June of 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt, serving as the first chair of the UN Human Rights Commission, oversaw the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The declaration was adopted unanimously. The Soviet Union's delegate abstained, objecting strongly to Article 13 of the declaration, which provided for the right of citizens to leave their country.
Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the border of each state. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country.
By 1953, the vast majority who resisted repatriation found homes in a host of countries around the world. 156,000 DPs entered Canada. Of these, approximately 40,000 were Ukrainian, a number equal to the Ukrainian Canadian military personnel who served in World War II.